Tonga, unlike many of its other Pacific neighbors, never lost its sovereignty to an imperial power. But why? Tonga had been an empire in its own right during the 1100s under the Tonga dynasty, having influence across the Pacific. However, civil war would greatly diminish its size and relegate the Tonga to a purely spiritual role. Tonga would eventually reunite under the Tuiha Takalaua, and remained so all the way until the 17th century when another civil war happened, which replaced the old dynasty with a new dynasty, and little else. This was around the time when Europeans first learned of the islands, beginning with the Dutch in 1616, who did nothing. The more important visitors would be the British, starting in the 1770s with Captain Cook's trips there. They would bring the first Christian missionaries in 1797, who began converting large portions of the native population. Only 2 years later in 1799, the king, Taufa'ahau, was killed, sending the nation into a brutal civil war. It was in this state of political and religious upheaval that in 1820 a young man named Taufa'ahau became chief of the small region of Ha'apai. Taufa'ahau was not just content with Ha'apai though. In 1833 he would peacefully annex the Vava'u Islands before conquering the main island of Tongatapu in 1845, and all the remaining chiefs by 1852. Military prowess far from defined Taufa'ahau's leadership though. In 1831, he was baptized as King George Tupu I after King George of England. George really liked British-style constitutional monarchy and wished to implement one in Tonga, with him as its head. More immediately, his devout Christianity would earn him a valuable ally in the missionaries. Both of these influences first began to show themselves in his policy while he was chief of just Ha'apai and Vava'u during the 1830s. In 1835, he would abolish serfdom in Vava'u, and in 1839 would create the Vava'u Code, the first ever written laws in Tonga. The code established some human rights and held chiefs accountable to the law just like their subjects, as well as enforcing George's religious principles, banning many things he saw as sinful, including traditional ceremonies, alcohol, and working on Sundays, with the latter carrying over to the country's constitution and still being illegal to this day. Speaking of the Constitution, in 1875, with the help of a close advisor, future Prime Minister, and at the time head of the Wesleyan Mission to Tonga, Shirley Baker, King George would enact the Constitution. It laid down the framework for a constitutional monarchy, and in many ways developed like one too, arising out of the conflicting desires of the king, the chiefs, the church, and the people. Each of these groups ended up with their own little rights and provisions. Having a constitution also made potential colonizers take Tonga's independence much more seriously. This isn't the only way the law at this time defended Tonga though. How King George dealt with land ownership in particular, both in the constitution and in other policy, played a big part in preventing colonization. He established that all land in Tonga would be officially owned by the king, that all adult male Tongans were entitled to land, and most importantly, he made it nearly impossible for foreigners to acquire land. This stopped the formation of the large, foreign-owned plantations which would take over many Pacific countries and result in their colonization, most famously in Hawaii, but also in other places like Fiji and Samoa. Religiously, King George and Shirley Baker would also work to distance Tonga from outside control by establishing the Free Church of Tonga in 1885, taking church control away from the Wesleyans abroad while keeping doctrine essentially the same. George would die in 1893, but only after unifying Tonga, creating lasting institutions respected by Western powers, allying with the missionaries without surrendering to them, and centering control over Tonga's land and economy in Tonga, among many other actions that would all help ensure Tonga's independence. So that's the story of how one man saved Tonga from colonization. One last note. Independence does not necessarily mean good governance. Tonga, like all places, has issues, and many of the same people and events which kept it independent also led to those problems. For example, the powers awarded to the king and nobility by the Constitution remained, with it taking about a decade of protests for the people to gain a majority of seats in the Assembly in 2010. Even after those reforms, over a third of seats are still appointed by the nobles, and they, as well as the king, continue to play a very active role in the nation's government. If and how much this situation should change is a pretty controversial topic in Tonga. In addition, George Tupu's wish to Christianize Tonga, while it won him the support of the missionaries, also accelerated the destruction of the traditional culture. Basically, nation building is complicated and always results in both good and bad outcomes. Alright, that's actually the end.